I never meant to get caught in that blizzard, but something else got caught with me that night. The wind howled against my cabin windows as I stared at the strange tracks in the snow. They started from nowhere and ended at my front door. I had been snowed in for 3 days at my grandfather's old hunting cabin in northern Maine. The forecast only called for 6 inches, but Mother Nature had other plans. The snow piled up past the windows, and the temperature dropped to -20. I was grateful for the stockpile of firewood and canned goods, but the isolation was starting to get to me. But then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the whistling wind, a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from everywhere, and nowhere at once. I convinced myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. The isolation does strange things to people, I told myself. But then the scratching started, gentle at first, like branches against the walls. But there aren't any trees close enough to touch the cabin. The scratching grew louder, more deliberate. It moved around the cabin's perimeter, testing each wall, each window. I huddled by the fireplace, clutching my grandfather's old hunting rifle. The warmth of the flames did nothing to stop the cold sweat running down my back. But then the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. Minutes stretched into hours as I sat there, frozen in place, waiting. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I woke to complete darkness. The fire had died, and with it, any sense of safety I had left. The temperature in the cabin had dropped dramatically. I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight. But then my light caught something that made my blood run cold. There were wet footprints on the wooden floor, leading from the front door to where I sat. They weren't human prints. They were too large, too oddly shaped, with what looked like 6 toes splayed out at impossible angles. I followed the prints back to the door with trembling steps. The heavy wooden door was still locked and bolted, but deep claw marks had been carved into the wood from the inside. I packed my things and left at first light. The storm had finally passed, but the tracks I found outside made me question everything I thought I knew about what lives in these woods. They started from nowhere in the middle of the untouched snow and ended at my door. Only this time, they were leading away from the cabin. The police said it was probably a bear, even though bears don't walk on 2 legs. The game warden said I was probably confused from being isolated for so long. But they can't explain one thing. Every winter since then, when the first heavy snow falls, I find those same 6-toed tracks in my backyard, hundreds of miles from that cabin. They always start from nowhere, and they always lead to my door. I should have known something was wrong when all the other radio stations went silent that night. As the night shift DJ at our small town radio station, I was used to being alone, but not like this. The winter storm had knocked out power to most of Millbrook Valley, but our backup generators kept us running. I took pride in being the only voice still broadcasting, giving updates to anyone still listening in their cars or battery-powered radios. The red on air. Light was my only companion as snow pelted against the studio windows. But then the phone calls started coming in. At first they were normal. People requesting songs, asking about road conditions, until that one call changed everything. "Something's in the storm," the trembling voice whispered. "It's taking people." I saw it happen. They walk out into the snow and they just vanish. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I tried to shake it off as someone playing a prank, but more calls followed, all telling the same story. People described their loved ones getting up in a trance-like state, walking out into the blizzard and disappearing. Each caller sounded more terrified than the last. But then the station's phone line went dead too. The silence was deafening as I sat in the cramped studio, my voice the only one left in the darkness. I kept broadcasting, hoping to warn others, though I wasn't sure anyone was still listening. The generator hummed steadily until it didn't. The lights flickered once, twice, then darkness. Only my emergency battery-powered lamp remained. I switched on my phone's flashlight, and that's when I noticed the frost creeping up the inside of the windows. But then I heard it through my headphones. A sound that shouldn't have been possible with our power dead. A soft, melodic humming, like a chorus of whispered voices singing an ancient lullaby. My eyes grew heavy as the haunting melody filled my ears. I caught my reflection in the studio window and watched in horror as my hand reached for the door handle against my will. My body moved on its own, drawn by that ethereal song. I fought against it with everything I had, but my feet kept moving toward the exit. The last thing I remember was the blast of cold air as the door swung open. The snow swirled around me in perfect spirals, and in the distance, dozens of dark figures standing perfectly still, their faces turned upward to the storm. They found me 3 days later, huddled in a snowbank 2 miles from the station. I couldn't explain how I got there or why I was still alive when they found 15 others frozen solid, scattered throughout town. The official report blamed mass hysteria and hypothermia. To this day, they still use my final broadcast as a case study in journalism schools, not because of what I said, but because of what the students hear in the static between my words. They say if you listen closely enough, you can still hear that melody, calling, always calling. I shouldn't have followed those tracks, but as a wildlife photographer, I'd never seen anything like them before. Each print was nearly 2 feet wide, with odd circular impressions that seemed to glow faintly blue in the twilight snow. The Alaskan wilderness had always been unforgiving, but this winter was different. Animals had been disappearing from their usual hunting grounds, and the locals whispered about something stalking the endless night. I'd laughed off their warnings about the White Death as superstition, until I saw those tracks. But then my guide refused to go any further. He was an Inuit elder who'd spent 60 years in these mountains, and I'd never seen fear in his eyes before. "It hunts in the white silence," he said before turning back. "When you hear nothing, that's when it's already too late." I pressed on alone, following the strange tracks deeper into the wilderness. The prints led me through a narrow valley where the snow was stained with what looked like luminescent blue fluid. My camera's battery died instantly when I tried to photograph it, despite being fully charged. But then the white silence fell. No wind, no crunch of snow under my boots. Even my breathing seemed muted, as if the very air was being sucked away. That's when I saw it, or rather saw through it. 20 feet ahead stood something that seemed to bend the light around it, like heat waves rising from hot pavement, but in reverse. The shape was massive, at least 12 feet tall. As my eyes struggled to focus, I could make out long, translucent limbs ending in circular paths, the source of those strange tracks. But then it moved. Not like any animal I'd ever seen. It flowed like liquid glass, each movement leaving trails of that ghostly blue luminescence in the air. I raised my backup camera with trembling hands, and the flash went off accidentally. The creature's reaction was instant and horrifying. Its form crystallized, becoming momentarily visible. What I saw in that split second haunts me. A body like living ice, organs glowing blue beneath a transparent exterior, and dozens of eyes that reflected the light like mirrors. But then it screamed. The sound was like glass shattering mixed with the deep cracking of a frozen lake. The air temperature dropped so rapidly that my tears froze on my cheeks. I ran blindly through the darkness, the creature's ethereal glow pulsing behind me. I don't remember how I made it back to the village. They found me half frozen, my camera equipment completely crystallized and shattered. The photos were ruined, all except one. But that single image doesn't show the creature. Instead, it shows me running. And behind me, my breath isn't coming out as steam. It's forming into crystalline shapes that almost look like hands reaching for my throat. The locals say I'm marked now. On cold nights, my windows frost over with those same circular patterns I saw in the snow. Sometimes I wake up to find blue luminescent fluid dripping from my ceiling. But when I turn on the lights, it vanishes. The doctors can't explain why my body temperature drops 20 degrees every time it snows, or why my eyes now reflect light like mirrors. I found the first number carved into the ice of my frozen bedroom window on December 21st. At first, I thought it was just a strange formation in the frost, but the precision of the carving was undeniable. It was perfectly etched into the ice, as if done by an expert hand. My house sits on 10 acres of wooded land in northern Vermont, and the nearest neighbor is 3 miles away. The winter had been particularly harsh, with temperatures dropping to record lows. I was used to the solitude, but something about that number made me uneasy. But then I found another number the next morning. 6. This time it was carved into the ice of my kitchen window. I checked the snow beneath all my windows. No footprints, no signs of anyone approaching the house. Just untouched white powder stretching into the darkness of the surrounding forest. Each morning brought a new number, always one less than the day before. 5 appeared on my living room window, 4 on the bathroom window, 3 on the garage door window. I took photos, called the police, but they said they couldn't drive out until the roads cleared. I was on my own. But then I noticed something else. Each day, as a new number appeared, the temperature dropped exactly 1 degree colder than the day before. The weather station reported it as an unprecedented phenomenon. No one could explain why only my property was affected. When 2 appeared on my front door window, the pipes in my house froze solid. I huddled under every blanket I owned, but nothing could keep out the bone-deep cold that had settled into the house. The thermometer read -40 degrees. But then came the morning I dreaded most. I woke to find 1 traced into the frost on the mirror above my bed. The temperature had dropped to -50. The cold was so intense it hurt to breathe. I tried to leave, to drive somewhere, anywhere. But my car wouldn't start, and my phone showed no signal. As the sun set on that final day, I sat in my darkened living room, waiting. The cold had become almost unbearable, and ice crystals formed in the air around me. As midnight approached, I heard it, a soft scraping sound coming from every window at once. But then everything stopped. The scraping, the wind, even my breath seemed to hang frozen in the air. In that perfect silence, I watched as a 0 began to carve itself into every window of my house simultaneously. The glass crackled as the ice spread, forming the perfect curves of the number. They found my house 3 days later, completely encased in a shell of crystal clear ice. The newspapers called it a freak weather phenomenon. Scientists came from around the world to study it, but none of them could explain the numbers, still perfectly preserved in the ice of each window, or why the temperature inside my house remained at absolute 0, even in the middle of summer. I survived, but I've never been warm since that night. The doctors say my core temperature is impossibly low, but somehow I'm still alive. Sometimes when it snows, I see numbers appearing in the frost, counting down again. But now they appear on other people's windows, and I'm the only one who can see them. I wish I could forget what I saw in those lights, what we all saw that night at the research station. They told us the aurora borealis would be spectacular, this far north in Iceland, but they never mentioned it would come down to touch us. We were a team of 6 climate researchers stationed at a remote observatory near the Arctic Circle. The isolation didn't bother us at first. We had our instruments, our data, and the most beautiful light show on Earth dancing above us every night. But then the lights changed. The usual greens and purples began shifting to colors we had no names for. Our equipment started registering impossible readings, and the radio signals we picked up, they weren't random static. I was the first to notice the pattern. Every night at exactly 3:17 a.m., the aurora would pulse in sequence, like a heartbeat. Our computers crashed trying to analyze the frequencies. The electromagnetic interference was so strong it made our fillings ache and left us with nosebleeds. But then the lights started reaching down. Tendrils of impossible colors stretched from the sky like fingers testing the water. They moved with purpose, with intelligence. We tried to contact the mainland, but all communications were dead. The temperature dropped to -70 the night it happened. We huddled in the main lab, watching through the reinforced windows as the lights descended. They coated the snow in a shimmering film that moved like liquid mercury. But it wasn't reflecting the aurora. It was reflecting things that weren't there, cities and landscapes that couldn't exist on Earth. But then Sarah stepped outside. We screamed for her to stop, but she walked toward the lights as if in a trance. The moment they touched her, she became translucent. We could see her organs, her bones, everything glowing with that alien light. She turned to us and smiled. But her teeth had become crystalline structures that emitted high-pitched frequencies. The others soon followed, one by one. Each walked out into that otherworldly glow, each transformed into something that only looked human on the surface. Only I remained inside, recording everything with a camera that was slowly melting in my hands. But then they came for me. Not the lights. My transformed colleagues. They pressed their altered faces against the windows, their crystalline teeth vibrating with messages I could almost understand. The glass began to crack as the lights swirled closer. They found the research station 3 months later, completely encased in a substance that defied analysis. The rescue team reported that the building was empty, though 6 sets of footprints led away from the station. Footprints that ended abruptly in the snow. They recovered only one piece of evidence. My camera. Most of the footage was corrupted, but one frame remained clear. It shows my 5 colleagues standing in the snow, their bodies transparent, their eyes reflecting colors that don't exist in our visual spectrum. They're pointing up at something beyond the camera's view, something that casts shadows upward into the sky. Sometimes on cold nights I see those colors again, flickering at the edges of my vision. My teeth ache with frequencies I can almost understand, and my skin becomes translucent in the moonlight. The doctors say I'm suffering from extreme hypothermia exposure. But they can't explain why my body temperature rises instead of falls when the aurora appears, or why my blood glows under ultraviolet light, or why I understand the messages now hidden in the static of every radio station. I still see those red mittens in my dreams, lying there in the snow perfectly placed, as if someone had carefully set them down. Emma would never have left them behind. They were her favorite Christmas present. As the lead detective on the case, missing children were nothing new to me. But this one was different. 8-year-old Emma Carroll vanished from her backyard during a light snowfall, leaving only those mittens and a single set of footprints that ended abruptly in the middle of the untouched snow. But then more children started disappearing, all within a 5-mile radius, all during snowfall, all leaving behind a single item of winter clothing: a blue scarf, a wool hat, a tiny boot. Each time, the same impossible footprints leading to nowhere. The media called it the Winter Walker case. Parents stopped letting their children play in the snow. Schools canceled outdoor activities. The whole town became a prison of fear as the snow kept falling, day after day, breaking all previous records. But then I noticed something in the evidence photos. In each image of the discarded clothing items, there was a reflection in the snow. A tall, thin figure standing just out of frame. When we enhanced the photos, the figure seemed to be wearing outdated clothing, like something from the 1950s. I dug deeper into the town's history. 70 years ago, 5 children vanished during the worst blizzard on record. They found only their winter clothing, carefully placed in the snow. The lead detective then was Thomas Wade, who himself disappeared while investigating the case. But then I found his diary in the police archives. The final entry described following a child's footprints in the snow, footprints that seemed to go on forever. He wrote about hearing children's laughter in the storm, and seeing a tall figure in old-fashioned clothes always standing just ahead of him. Last night, it started snowing again. I was working late at the station when I got the call. Another child missing. This time I was first on the scene. There in the backyard lay a green winter coat, and leading away from it, those same impossible footprints. But then I heard it, the sound of children laughing carried on the wind. Through the falling snow I saw them, multiple sets of footprints appearing in the snow ahead of me, as if invisible children were walking just out of sight. And there, at the edge of my vision, stood a tall figure in clothes from another era. I followed the footprints. I know I shouldn't have, but I could hear Emma's voice among the others. The prints led me deeper into the woods behind the house, the snow falling heavier with each step. The children's laughter grew louder, and I caught glimpses of small shadows darting between the trees. They found my badge and gun the next morning, carefully placed in the snow. The footprints leading to them ended abruptly, just like all the others. They say I've been missing for 3 months now, but time feels different here, where the snow falls upward and the children play eternal games in the gray twilight. Sometimes I see new detectives following our footprints, their badges gleaming in our strange light. I want to warn them to turn back, but the tall figure says we must welcome them. After all, there's always room for more players in his winter games, and the children need someone to chase them through the endless snow. I keep living this same winter day over and over, but each time the world gets a little more wrong. It started when I noticed the second moon in the sky, pale and broken, like a mirror's reflection of our own. December 15th, 2024. That's when everything changed. I was driving home through a snowstorm when my car's GPS started showing impossible readings. The distance to my house kept changing. 5 miles, 500 miles, 5 light years. The radio cycled through stations that shouldn't exist, playing music that made my ears bleed. But then I saw myself standing in the middle of the road, not just one version. Dozens of mess, all slightly different. One had silver eyes. Another had hands made of frost. One was transparent like glass. They all pointed to the woods. So I followed. The snow fell upward as I walked deeper into the forest. The trees began to shift, their branches twisting into fractal patterns that hurt my eyes. I checked my phone. It was still December 15th. It would always be December 15th. But then the timelines started bleeding together. I could see all versions of this day playing out simultaneously, like watching multiple TV channels overlapped. In one, I never entered the woods. In another, I'd been here for centuries. The versions of me I saw earlier, they were echoes from these other timelines. The deeper I went, the more realities I saw. Some were subtle changes. Different colored snow, strange constellations in the sky. Others were horrifyingly wrong. Worlds where physics worked backwards, where gravity was optional, where time flowed like molasses. But then I found the center. A perfect clearing where all timelines converged. In the middle stood a door made of light, its surface rippling like disturbed water. Through it, I could see fragments of every possible reality, and something else, something that had been waiting. It spoke without sound, showing me the truth. Our universe was collapsing, folding in on itself like a paper crane. This winter day was the crease point, the moment when everything went wrong. Each time the day repeated, more realities bled through the cracks. But then it made me an offer. I could stabilize the collapse by anchoring all these fractured timelines. But the price was becoming their caretaker, to exist in all of them simultaneously, keeping the fragments from drifting apart. I accepted. What choice did I have? Now I walk through infinite versions of this winter day. In one reality, I'm writing this warning. In another, I'm reading it. In thousands more, I'm living different versions of this same moment. Sometimes I catch glimpses of new people entering the forest, drawn by the anomalies bleeding through. I try to guide them back to their own timelines, but some refuse to leave. They become new echoes, new variations in the infinite winter. The scientist in me knows this is impossible. The laws of physics don't allow for timeline collapse or dimensional bleeding, but those laws only apply to our original reality, the one I can barely remember now. If you're reading this, check the sky. If you see that second moon, broken and wrong, you've already started to drift. The forest will call to you soon. You'll see versions of yourself, beckoning you deeper. My advice? Run. Run until you find a timeline where it's not winter, where there's only one moon, where December 15th is just another day. But if you do enter the forest, look for the version of me with silver eyes and frost-covered hands. That's the one who remembers the way back. The others, they've been here too long. They've forgotten they were ever human at all.